Hello and welcome to another edition of Sun Dragon Tips and Tricks. I'm Rebecca. I'm the owner of Sun Dragon Art and Fiber in downtown Brevard, North Carolina. It's Monday, so I'm here at my house and it is pouring rain outside, which has nothing to do with what we're going to do today. But anyway, I had a request. I don't know if this will specifically address it for stitch combos that can be flat but decorative. I thought we could develop that into a way to talk about basic stitch combos using just the knit and purl stitch. No increases, no decreases, just what can you do if you're inventing things or if you want to add texture to things. Now, know that if you're changing a pattern from how it's written to a different texture, that could completely change the gauge, and I cannot guarantee that will work. But it's something you can experiment with, definitely. We're going to learn some terminology along the way as well. I have started my little swatch with things called Garter and Stockinette, and we'll talk about what those are. And then we'll look at a couple of other basic combos and how you create them. So let's get to it. A few things for us to hang on to. So we're doing knitting, basic combos of knit and purl stitches, calling it part one, because there's always a part two. There's always other things we could talk about. And I have made the distinction that these are instructions for knitting flat, where you're knitting across and turning the work around and knitting back across it. To create these effects, if you're knitting in a circle, you will need to do something different, and that is a different video. So here's some things to keep in mind, or some things to learn if you don't know them already. What's really, really, really helpful is to learn to read your stitches, know what stitches look like. And I have some pictures down here we'll take a look at in just a second. The other thing is if there are knit and purl stitches in the same row, you need to set your yarn in place before you do the knit and purls. For a knit stitch, your yarn is in the back when you do a correct knit stitch and not on the side facing you. And for a purl stitch, it's just the opposite. Your yarn is in front facing you. Now, if you do not set your yarn up between stitches, you will end up with yarn overs and holes and things that don't make sense when you come back to them. For now, we will take a look at that as we go. Let's go to reading your stitches. I have boiled down the knit and purl stitches to just their basic forms. A knit stitch will look like a little V. I call it a V-neck. And all of this is coming from, if this was your physical neck, your head, what kind of a collar would that be making? I call that one a V-neck. Your working yarn is in back, is behind when you work a knit stitch. A purl stitch, this little guy here, I call it a turtleneck. I've also been known in videos or in lessons to call it a bump or a slash. Whatever helps you remember that a purl stitch hangs straight across and a knit stitch makes a little V. Keep that in mind. Your working yarn is in the front. And the connection between these two, the back of a knit stitch is a purl stitch and vice versa. So if you flipped this stitch around and looked at it, it would look like that. And if you flip this stitch around, it would look like this. That is part of what makes this work. So let's take a look at some of the basic fabric that can be created. What we're really talking about here is what's created when you do certain stitches. So here are some terms you might hear. The most basic stitch you can do is called garter stitch. Garter stitch is where you knit every row. When you knit every row and when you turn it around, you knit the next row and you turn it around and you knit the next row, you get stacking of the right side and wrong side of knit stitches facing both sides. This is reversible and it lays flat. It's wonderful. If you've only learned the knit stitch, this is a great way to make scarves. There are a lot of shawls now that involve garter as an integral part of the pattern. So let's color code this a bit. You know me, I like to color code. Let's make our knit. Again, this is what we see on the side that we're looking at. The knit stitch, the front of it, we're gonna make blue. And the front of a purl stitch, which is the back of a knit stitch, will make green. So what happens in garter is you will have a stacking of the front of knit stitches with the back of them, which will look like a purl. This looks like you have stacking of knits and purl stitches, but you don't, if you're knitting flat, you don't ever have to purl to get that effect. And again, I'm boiling this down to its basic components. A purl stitch has yarns that kind of go underneath and everything. I'm focusing on what's easy to identify and read, which are those slashes or the turtlenecks and the V-necks, and they're all stacked. Let's take a look at stockinette. Now, stockinette is what a lot of people think of when they think of knitting. They think all these V's running down the surface of the fabric. Now, to create that, you have to knit when the right side, when the outside is facing you. So you're going to knit one row. And then when you flip it around and the knit stitches, the outside is not facing you, you need to purl one row. And you repeat those 2 rows. All of these pattern stitches have some kind of repeat. This is a 2-row repeat. You knit a row and you purl a row. This is thinner, but can curl. Knitting one row and purling one row, though, can lead to it looking like there are all knit stitches on one side. And if you flipped it over, it would look like all the purl stitches are on the other side. And that has to do with what side is facing you when you are working the stitches. So the wrong side, the back side, will look like a whole bunch of purl bumps stacked on itself. But that is created by knitting a row and purling a row. Let's talk about some other easy techniques to do with just the knit stitch and the purl stitch. So another technique you might see a lot of is ribbing. And all of these on this side, I have used the simplest version of them, which is 1 stitch by 1 stitch. You can see versions of ribbing and seed stitch and moss stitch that are 2 by 2, 3 by 1. Oh, it gets all kinds of crazy. But we're talking about the most basic here. So ribbing is what happens when you have columns. It's 1 knit, 1 purl in the same row. So how I would read these stitches right here, with an even number of stitches. Let's flip this so it makes a little more sense. All right, I just redrew that because based on how we would work those stitches on a right side row, it was a little confusing. Again, there are extra strands connecting all of this. I've boiled it down to the basic features of what you will see. With an even number, how we would read this is row 1 is, I'm going to use K for knit and P for purl. We knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1. On row 2, we can't see this in the picture. When we turn it around, it is actually going to replicate. It is still going to be knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, because the stitches have flipped places. If that doesn't make any sense yet, one of the adages I say, once you can read your stitches, in this, once you have it set up, you want to knit your knits and purl your purls. So you have them stacked. And let's color code them. If you do it correctly, you will have a column of knit stitches, V's running down, a column of purl stitches, and they will alternate. Ribbing tends to be elastic. It's good for cuffs. It's good for cuffs and collars and gives a nice finished edge. Now let's talk about seed stitch. And one thing I want to make really clear here is what we call seed stitch. This is American terminology. It's an American term. In the UK and other places, this is actually referred to as a moss stitch. And we're doing the most basic form, which is a 1x1. Now take a look at this guy compared to that. How this is differentiated. So if we're going to read this from the bottom up and what has been done, going this way, then this way, then this way, we have knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1. And when you flip it over, you are going to have to reverse that. Purl 1. Remember, that's the back side of this, so it's not how it looks right here. We're trying to do something on the back side that represents the front. So purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1. You can see how this is different than that. These, they stack. Here they alternate. And remember, this is for an even number of stitches. These 2 rows repeat. And the thing to keep in mind, this is opposite of that. You want to knit your purls and purl your knits. That's how this one is successful. And what happens, you do the opposite of what you see hanging under the needle. This may make more sense as we do it with real yarn, but if we have knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, if we do the opposite on the next row, what will end up happening is we will have alternating stitches visible. However, it's not as simple. This row ended with a purl and the next row begins with a purl, because we also have to keep in track of what the different sides are doing. But I really think if you keep the adage in mind of purl your knits and knit your purls, do the opposite of what is hanging under the needle, you will get this alternating fabric. And this can lay pretty flat. It's also reversible. In fact, of all of these, I think the Stockinette is the only one that is not reversible. So let's look at the moss stitch last, the American moss stitch. It is a little more complicated. It is probably the most complex of the stitches we're looking at today. And instead of every row alternating like in the seed stitch, you stack things for 2 rows and then you alternate for 2 rows. So here's how I would read this an even number of stitches. It is a 4-row repeat. Everything else has been a 2-row repeat. Row 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1. Row 2 is the same, knit 1. Remember, it's what it looks like on the side facing you. The back side would be facing you. Purl 1, knit 1, purl 1. Row 3 is right here, and we want to do the opposite. Row 3 would be purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1. And then row 4, we want to stack on top of row 3. So again, we're going to purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1. So to take them a little bit out of order, row 2 and row 4, the even rows, knit your knits, purl your purls, and rows 1 and rows 3, you want to knit your purls and purl your knits. You're alternating. Odd rows and even rows have different instructions. What you'll end up with is a little bit more of an intricate stitch that again is reversible and may lie flatter. All of these will lie a little bit flatter than the garter stitch. However, if you have knits and purls on the same side, it can be thicker than full-blown stockinette. Let's see what all of this looks like with real yarn. As I showed you in the beginning, I have garter and stockinette here. Here is the garter where you knit every row. You're going to see purl bumps. And in between here, we have the knit rows, the purl and knit on the same side. It's not from doing purls and knits, but when you knit every row, you get the back side, and in here the front side, the back side, the front side, the back side, the front side of your knit stitches. Now if I turn it around, this part down here, just focus down here, it's the same thing. We have ridges. We have the front side in here, back side, front side, back side, front side of knit stitches. That's what happens when you knit every row. I wasn't going to do that on camera because I think even the most basic, hopefully, I'm making assumptions and I shouldn't. But if you knit every row and it looks like this, you're doing a great job. Now above it, we have a few rows of all these facing us. And that's when you knit a row. And then when this side is facing you, you purl a row. And if we take a look, the garter down here, we have ridges and we have divots. We have hills and valleys. Here, not so much, or they're much shallower because we have all of the hills just pumped on top of each other, plopped on top of each other. So if I was to do a couple more rows of stockinette, this is how I can tell what to do. When I take a look at this, the V stitches are right underneath the loops on the needles. The V's are facing me as I get ready to knit. So I know that to have more V's on top of this, I need to knit. As I get ready to work, I should say. I didn't know if I was going to knit. So with my yarn in the back, if my yarn doesn't get caught on my needles, I'm going to knit a row. Now, when I turn this around to do the next row, I have turtlenecks, I have slashes, I have things choking off my loops on my needle. That tells me I need to purl. If I started to knit here, take a look. If I started to knit here, it would not match. I would have V's over bumps over turtlenecks. It would not match. So that's how I know. The other side too. If I had started purling on that side, I would have had turtlenecks over V's. I would not have accomplished my goal of stockinette. So I'm going to purl across this row. I'm doing what I see. For a lot of these stitches, knitting your knits and purling your purls. It depends on what effect we want. That doesn't work for seed stitch, but we're not there yet. All right, so I have finished a purl row because I saw those bumps. And if I turn it around, the back side of a purl stitch is a knit stitch, so I've added more V's. Now this can curl on the edges. If I kept going, this would want to curl up and it would not want to lay flat. The only thing keeping it flat right now is the garter section underneath it. So let's try a sampling of ribbing. 1 by 1 ribbing. That means knit a stitch, move your yarn to the front, and purl a stitch. I'm pretty sure I have a video just on ribbing. Move to the back. Most important when you're switching between knits and purls in one row is to always remember to set your yarn. Yarn needs to be in back to knit, Yarn needs to be in front to purl. Yarn needs to be in back to knit. And I'm changing every stitch. This can make it take longer, but can give us, whoop, fixed it with my fingers, can give us a really neat effect. Now, if I have an even number of stitches, if things go well, I should end with a purl stitch. And then when I turn it around, it's hard to see when we're just starting, but I have a V here, I have a turtleneck here, I have a V, I have a turtleneck, I have a V. So now that I've got the ribbing set up, with an even number of stitches, I'll always start with a knit, but we can also read our stitches and say knit goes on top of a knit. This is a purl, so I want to purl. This is a knit, so I want to knit, and etc. I'm going to put purls over purls and knits over knits. And if I need to, if I forget where I am, I can look at what's underneath the loops that are coming at me to figure out what to do next. Ended on a purl, that's a good sign when it's an even number. And we can see how this looks different than down here. As we continue to go, I'm going to do a couple more rows. What may be most visible on either side is going to be those knit stitches popping out. However, they're going to look bigger and fluffier, and there's going to be a more elasticity than this part down here. So again, I see V's, so I'm going to knit. I already know where I'm going, so I'm setting my yarn, but that's a turtleneck, so I'm going to purl. You can always check what is happening under your needle to see if it's lining up. We have a column of V's very prominently there. That's the most important thing for me to know that my ribbing is staying on track. I can just count knit one, purl one, whoop, knit one, purl one, and keep going with that. But I can also look and see that I have my columns of V's and my columns of turtlenecks that are really underneath. They're kind of recessing a little bit. Ribbing can sometimes be a little thicker. It's more on the lines of garter, even though the pattern it produces is different. So now, again, it's reversible. If I turn this around to do my next row, it's the wrong side because I have all the purl bumps showing in the stockinette section, but it looks the same on either side for the ribbing. Let me get a couple more rows in. If I speed this up on camera, it won't be sped up too fast. Don't want to make anyone totally motion sick. Let's get in a couple more rows. Well, let's get in one more row. How about that? Because then we can start our seed stitch. That means I may not have to speed it up. You just listen to me chat. I'm going to vamp and fill the space. Again, if I wonder where I am and get off track, that's a purl. That's a knit. I want to knit my knits and purl my purls for ribbing. Now here's the fun thing. If I want to do a seed stitch. Starting the seed stitch, I want to keep the right side of a seed stitch, row 1, just like I told you on the whiteboard. So I'm going to actually match this for a second. The real work of the seed stitch will not happen until our next row. So row 1 of seed stitch will look a lot like ribbing in that we knit one and purl one all the way across. And as you get used to the motion of stitches, if they fall off your needle like mine just did, you can learn how to fix them. Okay. Now, what seed stitch does that is different than ribbing. Ribbing was knit one, purl one, and then knit your knits and purl your purls. Seed stitch is do the opposite. So on this back row where I see a knit, I want to purl it. I'm going to start opposite, purl one, and then knit one. When I see a purl, I knit it. But then I keep going with the same order. Purl one. We're alternating between stitches. Knit one, purl one, knit one, purl one, knit one, purl one, knit one, purl one, knit one. And on the opposite stitch that I did on the row before, you can see it's starting to make a little bit of a checkerboard. And when I turn it around, if I was ribbing, this would look like a big mistake, but I'm not. I'm doing seed stitch, or what they in the UK they will call a moss stitch, but American terms, seed stitch. So this row, we're going to go back to knitting one and purling one, or to keep you on track, if you see a purl bump like that, you want to knit it. If I see a knit stitch, I want to purl it. And I've established my repetition. We're going to alternate between knits and purls. Knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl. If I can get in there. So there you can start to see the difference. We've got a cute little checkerboard going on. This time I think I will possibly speed some of this up. I want to get a couple more rows in, but again, I see we didn't have the stranding of yarn there. This is a knit stitch, which means I want to start with the opposite and then change every stitch. So I'm going to start with a purl, knit, purl. Let me put a couple more rows in and we'll see what it looks like. Again, on this side, I see a purl bump and a knit. So I'm going to start with a knit and a purl. I'm doing the opposite. I'm knitting my purls and purling my knits. So there's our checkerboard. I'm going to knit across the next row just to put a ridge here so we can tell the difference between what is seed and what is moss. All right, we won't see much yet, but hopefully there'll be a distinction there for where we start the moss stitch. So the moss stitch, we're going to do one by one moss, and the easiest thing to start off with is we're going to knit one, purl one, just like we did for seed stitch, but then row 2 is a little different. Let's take a look. If you ever stop in the middle of the row and you don't know where you are, I just did a V. There's a purl before that. I just did a knit. It's time to purl. All right. Now, if you remember from the whiteboard, the second row, you want to knit your knits and purl your purls. You want to stack. So I have a V there. I want to start by knitting. I'm going to do knit one, purl one, again, all the way across, making sure I knit my knits and I purl my purls. All right, that was my row number 2. Now my row number 3, if we take a look, it looks like it's the beginning of ribbing, but nope, that's not what we want. We want to change this up and make it moss. So on the odd rows, this is row number 3, that's a knit stitch. I want to do the opposite. I want to purl my knits and knit my purls. And once I've set up the order, I just purled. Now I'm going to knit, and then I'm going to purl. And every once in a while, I can check to make sure that's a knit. I want to purl it, that the order is still going correctly. So that was row 3. Now remember, row 4 is an even row. On even rows, I want to knit my knits and purl my purls. That's a purl, so I want to purl it. And that sets up the rhythm of what I will do for the rest of the row, because then I knit and purl and knit and purl. And every once in a while check that my knit is over a knit because I'm on an even wrong side row, and purl, knit, and purl to the end of the row. Now again, to start setting up this pattern more in place, we can already see how it differentiates. This one's very checkerboard down here. This one has elongated pieces. It's a checkered board, but it's a rectangular rather than a square. And since I'm on a right side row, I want to knit my purls and purl my knits. Here's a purl, I want to knit it. And then alternate. Purl, knit, purl. Every once in a while check. I'm knitting and it's over a purl stitch. That is correct for an odd row. And keep going. Now again, I'm on a wrong side row. I want to knit my knits and purl my purls. I want them to stack now. So I have a knit there. I'm going to start with a knit. Again, on the back side rows, on my even rows, make sure my purls are over my purls and my knits are over my knits. Here we can see we've got rectangles that are jig-jogging over the square checkerboard, over the ribbing. Remember, the wrong side of this, it's all the purl stitches facing us and the garter at the bottom. I think this is a long enough sample for now. It's a very, very small sample, I know. But let's go over it once again up to the top. We have garter down here, knitting every row. Stockinette in here is knitting a row and purling a row, which makes all the knits look like they're on the front side. Ribbing, knit one, purl one, and then match your knits and your purls every row. Seed stitch, knit one, purl one, and then every row knit your purls and purl your knits. So it alternates and you get this cool checkerboard. And then moss stitch. On your odd rows, you knit your purls and purl your knits. On your even rows, you knit your knits and purl your purls, and it's a tongue twister, but you get more of an alternating texture with longer lines going up, longer columns. All of these are reversible except for the stockinette right in there. All of these will look the same on both sides except stockinette. That looks very particular on one side versus the other. So thanks for coming along on the journey of this sampler, garter, knitting every row, stockinette, knitting a row, purling a row, ribbing, knit one, purl one, make them all match on every row, knit your knits and purl your purls. In here, we have just a little section right in there of what in America we call seed stitch. You might hear it be called moss stitch somewhere else. Not to be confusing, but knit one, purl one, and then every row, purl your knits and knit your purls. And then the moss stitch up here, where it depends on the even or odd row, if you're knitting your knits and purling your purls, or knitting your purls and purling your knits. Go back and look at my whiteboard if you'd like a little clearer definition on some of those. Write me with questions. Happy to help you with that. Remember, all of it is reversible except for the stockinette. That one will look different, front to back. Please consider subscribing if you haven't already. Our numbers are growing and that is so much fun. Thank you for joining the Sun Dragon community. Remember, you can check out the Sun Dragon Sideshow if you want to see all the projects that Liz and I are working at Sun Dragon Art and Fiber in Brevard, North Carolina. And consider becoming a patron if you'd like. If you like what you see in these videos and you'd like to support my work and the shop's work, please consider becoming a patron over at patreon.com/sundragon. Any level of monthly support ends up in the credits here. We even got a new person in the last 24 hours and I'm going to add her as we go. So let me know what you would like to see a video on. Next week, we might return to some life lessons from knitting and crocheting. And as always, may your crafting be filled with joy and confidence. Bye-bye. You tried to help me film today, but I didn't catch you on camera, and then you said, nope, I'm gonna go to sleep. It would have been absolutely hilarious if your little paw was on camera, but angle wasn't set up right. I know, yeah? Oh, you're getting me with your claw right there. That's a back off sign. Say bye-bye.